The dawn cracked open with a sledgehammer's roar, not just shattering the stillness, but slicing through Ruby's heart like a jagged blade through silk. Ruby, 58, stumbled on her porch, her dark hands trembling around a chipped coffee mug as she gaped at the carnage of her rose bed. Petals strewn like blood, stems snapped like bones, a note stabbed into the wreckage with a rusted nail. "Get out, black trash." Across the towering new fence loomed Greg, her white neighbor, his cold gray eyes glinting with a predator's glee, a smirk curling his lips as he hefted the hammer. In that gut-wrenching, airless instant, Ruby knew this wasn't about flowers. It was a war on her very existence, a siege on the soil her family had bled to claim, and the battle had just begun with a ferocity that threatened to uproot her soul. Ruby Jackson had called the modest clapboard house on Elm Street home for 32 years, a hard-won inheritance from her parents who'd clawed it from the grip of redlining in the 60s, a defiant patch of earth amid whispered slurs and midnight threats. Now retired after decades as a nurse, her hands, calloused from lifting patients, soothing fevers, had turned the backyard into a sanctuary, a riot of roses, marigolds, and lavender blooming under her care. The neighborhood had morphed over time, from a tight-knit black enclave to a patchwork of white newcomers lured by cheap lots and quaint charm. But Ruby stayed, her roots too deep to tear loose, her garden a testament to resilience. She was pruning her prize-winning roses that humid June morning when Greg Harper rolled in next door, a wiry man of 60 with a salt and pepper beard and a pickup truck groaning under boxes. She'd waved, her smile warm as she called over the low picket fence. "Welcome to Elm. Need a hand unloading?" He'd flicked his gazer away, his gray eyes narrowing to slits, and grunted, "I'll manage," before turning his back. Ruby shrugged. New folks took time, but the next day the fence shot up. 8 feet of raw pine slammed into the ground overnight, a brutal wall blotting out the sunrise she'd cherished since she was a girl skipping rope on this very porch. She stood at the property line, peering up at the jagged barrier, her gardening gloves still on, the scent of roses clinging to her fingers. "Guess he likes his space," she muttered, but a chill snaked down her spine, like the whispers she'd heard as a child, when white neighbors slashed her dad's tires for daring to mow his lawn too proudly, or the night her mom found in-words scrawled on their mailbox. She shook it off, turning back to her blooms, but the unease lingered, a quiet drumbeat of warning she couldn't silence. The fence was just the opening salvo. A week later, Ruby woke to a crash that yanked her from sleep. The roses she'd nursed for a decade lay in ruins, petals shredded like confetti from a nightmare, stems snapped like brittle twigs, a gaping wound where beauty had thrived. The note, "Get out, black trash," fluttered in the dawn breeze, its scrawl a vicious scar across her mourning. She knelt in the dirt, her hands trembling as they brushed the wreckage, her breath catching in a throat raw with fury she hadn't felt since the night her clinic was egged in '89 for hiring too many of her kind. Greg's silhouette loomed over the fence, leaning on a shovel, his smirk a blade twisting in her gut. "Rough night, huh?" he called, his voice oozing mock pity, his eyes glinting with something darker. Ruby rose, wiping dirt from her knees, her dark gaze locking his with a fire she couldn't douse. "This you're doing?" she asked, her tone steady but edged like a scalpel. He shrugged, turning away with a chuckle. "Can't prove a damn thing. Better watch your step, though." She called the sheriff, her voice calm, but forged in iron, but Deputy Rawls, a lanky white kid barely 30 with a permanent smirk, rolled up with a yawn, his boots scuffing her walkway. "No witnesses, no proof," he drawled, kicking a broken stem with casual disdain. "Probably just vandals. Don't turn it into a race thing." Ruby's jaw tightened, her fists balling at her sides, the heat rising in her chest. "Vandals with a grudge and a pen?" she shot back, her eyes boring into his. He smirked wider, tipping his hat with a lazy flick. "File a report if it makes you feel better. Won't change squat." That night, Ruby sat on her porch, the shattered garden a ghost in the moonlight, her coffee cold in her hands. She thought of her mom, who'd planted those roses after a white landlord refused her a lease, whispering through tears, "We grow where they won't let us." She thought of her dad, who'd rebuilt their mailbox after every slur, his hands steady despite the hate. "They're testing me," Ruby thought, her chest a furnace of resolve, her eyes tracing the stars her parents had once wished upon. "But I'm not leaving. Not now, not ever." Greg's war didn't pause at roses. It grew claws. Over the next week, Ruby found trash dumped in her yard, rotting food spilling from torn bags, beer cans glinting in the dawn, cigarette butts scattered like ashes of contempt. She cleaned it silently, her back screaming with each bend, but the third morning brought a brick crashing through her kitchen window, glass exploding across the linoleum like a gunshot's aftermath, a scrawled note tumbling amid the shards. Last warning. She stood in the debris, her pulse hammering, the jagged edges mirroring the fury clawing her insides, her hands shaking as she swept the mess with a broom that felt too small for the weight of it all. She confronted Greg at his gate, her voice low but forged in steel, her gardening apron still tied from Dawn's work. "Why? What's this about?" He leaned close, his breath sour with whiskey, his eyes glinting with a cold malice. "Keeping my space clean. Don't need your kind dragging it down next door." Ruby's gaze narrowed, her spine stiffening like iron. "This is my home, built by my folks, paid in sweat and tears. You don't get to erase that." He laughed, a sound like gravel scraping metal. "Move or deal with it. Your call, lady." She reported it again, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest, but Rawls shrugged, his smirk a permanent fixture. No evidence. Could have been anyone. Ruby's neighbor on the other side, Mrs. Ellen Carter, a frail white widow of 70 who'd lived there since Eisenhower, peeked over her roses, her voice quavery but fierce. "I saw him throw that brick, Ruby. I'll tell him straight." Ruby squeezed her hand, a flicker of gratitude piercing her dread, but Rawls waved it off. "Old lady's eyes ain't sharp. Can't pin it on him." That evening, Ruby's nephew, Malik, 25, roared up after his shift at the auto shop, his mechanic's hands clenched into fists, his eyes blazing with a fire she knew too well. "Auntie, let me handle this punk. Teach him what's what." She gripped his arm, her voice firm as bedrock. "No, baby, we don't sink to that. We rise above, always have." Malik's jaw twitched, his breath heaving, but he nodded, storming off to cool his head, his truck peeling out with a growl that echoed her own suppressed rage. Ruby refused to break. She replanted her garden, new roses, marigolds, a defiant burst of color rising from the ashes, her hands steady despite the ache that gnawed her bones. She borrowed Malik's old phone, live streaming the process on a community page, her voice calm but edged with steel. "This is my home. Watch me rebuild what they can't destroy." Her eyes burned into the lens, and the video flickered online, quiet at first, views ticking up like a heartbeat gaining strength. Greg escalated. Late one night, she woke to the stench of gasoline, her flower beds ablaze, flames licking the fence like hungry tongues. She stumbled out in her nightgown, grabbing a hose, dousing the fire with frantic sprays, her shouts swallowed by the crackling inferno. Greg watched from his porch, a lighter glinting in his hand, his smirk a silent dare as the orange glow danced in his eyes. Ruby's heart thundered, her arms trembling with the hose's weight, but she kept spraying, soaking the earth until the flames died, her garden a charred skeleton under the moon's pale stare. Ellen shuffled out in her slippers, her phone trembling as she filmed, her voice cracking with indignation. "I've got you this time, you bastard. I've got proof." Malik roared up in his truck, leaping out with a wrench raised like a club, his face a mask of fury. "I'll kill him, Andy." Ruby blocked him, her voice a whip. "No fists, use this." She shoved her phone at him, and he live-streamed, Greg's silhouette stark in the firelight, the lighter a damning flare, and posted it, tagging every local group with a caption raw as blood. "This coward burns my aunt's life. See him now." By dawn, the video detonated, hundreds of views swelling to thousands, comments raging like a storm. "That's Ruby's place. She's a saint. Arrest this thug." The young white couple next to Or Mark and Ginny Thompson, both 30, rushed over with their toddler, Lily, in tow, shovels in hand. "We saw it from our window. We're with you," Ginny said, her eyes fierce as she handed Ruby a trowel. Mark nodded, his voice tight. "He's a disgrace. Let's fix this." They replanted together, sweat mixing with dirt, Lily toddling between them with a tiny spade, as shares climbed into a viral roar. The town erupted. Protests flared outside Greg's house the next dusk, a ragtag crowd of black and white neighbors wielding signs. "Ruby stays. No room for cowards." Sheriff Rawls, cornered by the viral blaze, hauled Greg in. Ellen's shaky footage and Malik stream were ironclad, the lighter and noose around his neck. He was fined for vandalism and arson, forced to dismantle the fence under a court order as neighbors watched from their lawns, his sneer fading into a scowl as the pine planks crashed down. But the war wasn't over. That night, Ruby woke to pounding on her door. Greg's brother, Carl, 62, a hulking ex-con with a shaved head and a swastika tattoo snaking up his arm, loomed to the porch light, his fist raised. "You think you've won, huh? This ain't done," he bellowed, slamming a crowbar into her porch railing, with splintering like gunfire. Ruby stood her ground, her voice steady despite the quake in her chest. "I've lived through worse than you. Get off my land." Malik burst from his truck, parked from earlier visit, wrench swinging, but Mark and Ginny charged for next door, Mark tackling Carl with a linebacker's force, Ginny dialing 911 with trembling hands. Sirens wailed, and Rawls arrived, this time with backup, cuffing Carl as he spat curses, his threats drowned by the Thompsons' shouts. "Leave her be." Greg watched from his window, silent, his lighter gone, his brother's arrest a mirror of his own defeat. Ruby stood on her shattered porch, her garden glowing in the floodlights, her eyes wet but unbowed. The aftermath was a storm's wake. Greg's fine doubled, Carl jailed for assault, defense a pile of rubble under a court mandate. Ruby didn't gloat. She tended her reborn garden, roses budding anew, marigolds blazing defiantly, and hung a sign, "Flowers for all," its letters bold against the dawn. The Thompsons brought Lily to pick blooms. Ellen baked cookies with trembling hands, and Malik grinned, filming the quiet victory. "You're a legend, Auntie, Elm's queen." The block shifted, protests morphed into gatherings, neighbors black and white sipping lemonade on Ruby's porch, her roses a bridge across old divides. Greg stayed silent, but one dusk he shuffled over, hands jammed in pockets, his beard streaked with gray defeat. "Didn't mean it to go this far," he muttered, eyes on the dirt. Ruby handed him a marigold, her voice steady as stone. "I'm here for love, not hate. Hope you learn that someday." He took it, nodding faintly, and shuffled back, the low fence between them a fragile truce. Months later, Ruby's garden thrived, a beacon on Elm Street, her porch a haven, Ellen's laughter mingling with Lily's giggles, Mark and Ginny grilling burgers, Malik spinning tales of the fire night. Greg's yard sprouted flowers too, a hesitant echo, his windows open for the first time in years. Ruby sipped tea, watching dusk settle, her parents' whispers in a breeze. "We grow where they won't let us." She smiled, scars etched deep but roots unshakable. Her home a testament to a war won with dirt, blooms, and a heart too fierce to break.